Whether it's Tennessee Williams' tragic victim, Blanche Dubois, in A Streetcar Named Desire, revealing at the end of the play, in the final moments of the play, that she's always depended on the kindness of strangers. Or Shakespeare's Richard III in his opening soliloquy, where he outlines word for word his sinister machinations. And he says, "And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain." Or Effie White's. We'll do this. That looks safer. Or Effie White's brutal ballad, heart-wrenching ballad, And I'm Telling You I'm Not Going, from the musical Dreamgirls, where she literally belts out that you're going to love me. Now, what do these three things have in common? Yes, they are all characters brought to life by actors, but there's something more important. The things that they have in common with each other, they actually have in common with the audience. And it's what we all want from one another. Whether it's at the end of the day or by the end of the play, we all want to be loved and listened to. My name is Danielle Bruce, and I grew up in the theater, literally in a theater. Oh, Kenny, I'm not very good at this. Okay. You do it. That's a great idea. Okay. My parents ran a small but successful playhouse on Coronado Island in the 70s and 80s. And they worked 30-hour days designing and directing show after show. And where most kids got plunked down in front of the TV, and that would keep them entertained, well, I got plunked down in front of the stage. So theater was my television. And I would sit there night after night, and I would just watch rehearsals, and I would go back and I would memorize the blocking and the lines, and then I would go back to my room that night, and I would play all the parts by myself, including the director, which happened to be my dad. So my childhood was really rather magical, and it was full of eccentricities and adventures. And as an adult, I've realized that there are a handful of philosophies that have been passed down to me and from my childhood in the theater. And I first overheard them as a little girl. I would hear my mom or dad talk about them with actors, and it would be part of their process, or developing a character, or creating a cohesive production. And then, as I got older, it became about me and my choices. And maybe for a pithier response than usual, my parents called on these tenets, and they were like commandments. You know, they helped solve ethical and moral dilemmas, and they were really sound and insightful pieces of advice. So, these, I'll call them maxims. These 5 maxims have become guiding principles throughout my life. Now, they're 100% my opinion, and they're from my own life experiences. And yes, they did originate in a world of make-believe, let's say that. But they can be applied to our lives. And in fact, I think if we do apply them to our lives, we will be more understanding and sympathetic of one another. And I also think we'll make decisions that will have a more fulfilling life. You're much better than me at this. Number 1, we all want to be loved and listened to. Now, you got a sneak preview of this in the introduction. But it is so important, and I don't think you can really oversell this one. It is critical to how we understand ourselves and how we relate to one another. Ultimately, it's what every person wants from another person. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I see evidence of this every day in my life, much more than I see it on stage. And we want to be validated, respected, heard, seen. And it just becomes painfully obvious with characters in a play. Because reality on stage is heightened. That's why we don't want it to be what it really is. People are people, but they're also personifications, you know? And we can clearly see what happens to characters who haven't been loved and listened to. There are antagonists, there are villains. And they become, that's not to say that protagonists don't want to be loved and listened to. The thing is, they are. And they are loved and listened to. And there are heroes. But we can see the damage that's been done to a human being that exists without the security of being loved and listened to. I mean, whether it's Richard, Duke of Gloucester, or our 45th President of the United States. I mean, somewhere along the way, somebody did not love and listen to them when it really mattered most. So what I say to that is, and what I've taken from that, is whenever somebody rubs me the wrong way or gets my hackles up, I think, be patient, be kind. Somebody didn't love and listen to them when they needed it most. Number 2. Ooh, this one's fun. Better than is not a standard. In my youth, I auditioned for Star Search, and for those of you who are too young to know what that was, it was a talent contest with a lot of singing and dancing, and kind of like an American Idol, but 20 years ahead of its time. And the auditions were in downtown LA, and it was a cattle call, which means that there were thousands of obnoxious kids with their obnoxious stage moms waiting in a parking lot for 6 or more hours to audition. And I was sandwiched between an adorable Asian girl that couldn't sing or dance but could fold herself up into a suitcase. She was a contortionist. And then the girls behind me were twins from Sherman Oaks, and they were there to sing the theme song to a short-lived Tony Randall, if anybody remembers this, a short-lived Tony Randall sitcom called Love, Sidney. And yeah, well, those two were real annoying and a little bit tone deaf. And that's, remember, over 6 hours with those guys. I was prepared to sing Everything's Coming Up Roses from Gypsy a cappella. Now, of course, they had an accompanist, but that was for the kids that had sheet music. And I was not one of those kids. This is an important plot point. I was not one of those kids. So I go in and I sing, and I'm starting off, and it's real good. And then I hear something that sounds a lot like a piano. And I look over, and the pianist, the accompanist, is playing, because she knew the music. Without sheet music, she knew it, and she thought she could help me out. Well, I got so frazzled, so thrown off, that I just stopped singing, and I looked at her, and I blamed her out loud for screwing up my audition. And this is as I was gently being ushered out of the building. But so, nevertheless, my name was not on that callback sheet. But I did go home, still furious, and I told my mom what happened, this time without crying. And I'll never forget. I mean, I said to her, you know, I may have also said some things like, well, at least I was better than those 2 girls from Sherman Oaks that were tone deaf, and I had to be better than that girl who could just get into the suitcase and eat her foot. And I was, you know, we were, and my mom, just I'll never forget that she looked at me and said, Danielle, this is how she said, Danielle, calm down. This wasn't your best audition. You're going to have those. You're going to have a lot more of those. It's okay. And these kids, they were auditioning. They were nervous too. And besides, you really can't in one breath tell me and insult and belittle the person you're comparing yourself to, and then in the next breath tell me that you're better than they are and expect me to praise you. That's just not how it works. Better than is not a standard, kiddo. That was the other one, kiddo. And I thought, and now that I'm an adult and a director, I recoil at the thought that somebody could just be content with better than as their standard, let alone be boastful about it. I heard her. But the danger, here's it, the danger of using expressions like that in the theater and on stage is that it encourages a lackluster complacency. And that's the biggest problem. And it can spread like wildfire. And I think the thing about live theater that makes it so thrilling is the same thing that makes it so challenging, is that every performance is a clean slate. You get a chance every night to go out there and give it your best for that audience, because that's what they deserve. Now, of course, that's pretty easy to do on an opening night with a packed house. The trick is to do it and to find the magic and the inspiration and give it your best when it's for people in the audience on a Sunday matinee. Ask yourself, what am I doing and why am I doing it? My mom loved Shakespeare. She loved studying it, discussing it, and playing it. And my sister, she inherited this love and the proficiency. Now, don't get me wrong. I appreciate Shakespeare. And I can't imagine theater without his plays. And I'm really grateful that it's in the public domain. But that's not love. They love Shakespeare for the language. And I would always say, it's the language that keeps people from loving Shakespeare. It's cryptic and intimidating. But here's a secret. Even the best Shakespearean actors have to decode the language. They have to analyze the words and the text. And they're always asking themselves, what am I doing and why am I doing it? But it's seamless. It's like breathing for them, you know? And so they always know what their character's doing and why. They identify what, and then they answer why. And whatever you're playing, but particularly if you're playing Shakespeare. If you don't know what you're doing and why you're doing it, don't expect your audience to, because they certainly won't. Now, we rarely hold ourselves accountable in this way in our daily lives. But imagine if we did, if we kind of took that inventory and checked in with ourselves. Would we make different decisions? Yeah, I think we actually would. Now, we certainly don't have the parameters that an actor has when they take on a character, but we do face consequences, and we're continuously making choices. Some are insignificant and mundane, and others are monumental and life-changing. So it may seem pedantic to answer these two obvious questions, but if it keeps somebody from experiencing road rage, or if it helps somebody not have resentment or regret, I say they're worth asking and answering. Know your value. I remember a few years ago I went to see a production of Harold Pinter's Betrayal. This is a 3-person play. Well, it's three characters and a waiter. That's actually how it winds up looking. And it deals with an extramarital affair and the deception that goes along with that. The scene I'm thinking of, that I remember most, was in a restaurant, and the dialogue is sparse but deliberate, and Pinter, as a playwright, was known for this kind of subtext and silence that created a tremendous kind of tension. And, well, that was until the waiter enters, the waiter in this production. I remember that he entered with 2 plates as though he was miming a tightrope, and he was tenuously kind of balancing them on his fingers, and then he put the plates down on the table, and he was making waitery gestures, and then he was kind of loitering and doing a lot of face acting, like this, and this is a tense scene with a lot of silence. And, I would have laughed out loud if I wasn't so pissed, but I felt so bad for those actors, and they really got hung out to dry. He totally pulled focus and hijacked their scene, and there was nothing they could do about it. And that was a great example of not knowing their value, and it was the first time it ever dawned on me that when that happens, we call it eating this, chewing the scenery or being a ham or whatever, and that's all well and good when you're, playing Bambi in the 5th grade play, but then you go to do a production of a show, and you got to know your value. And very rarely does it happen in reverse, that somebody doesn't know that they're important to the show. It's the person that wanted that role and didn't get it, and then they have the chance to be on stage, and maybe they got somebody in the audience, and they got this, and that they just do something a little extra, that it wasn't in the text or in the blocking. And they need that. And this is also the same actor. We all know people like this in our daily lives. I mean, you can find them at funerals, crying the hardest in the corner with people consoling them, and you're not even sure how they knew the person who passed. Or maybe at a wedding that they're giving some impromptu toast that nobody asked for. These are the same people, and they're also the people in theater that are happy to offer suggestions, have no reservations about chiming in about what the actor's performance is and what they think they could do to improve it. These are the same people. And so, what I've also noticed, though, sadly, is that these are the same people that haven't been loved and listened to. Consequently. Number 5. Now, us theater folk know exactly what's meant by don't play the ending. For the rest of the world, it's just some esoteric, kind of artsy-fartsy theater term that really doesn't have any relevance. In the last year, I would say it's become the most relevant phrase in my life. It's practically become a mantra. So that we understand what is meant by don't play the ending in its original context, I would just say, in the simplest terms, it's a gentle warning to an actor that they're doing something or playing something that early in the show that maybe gives away or spoils something for the audience that they need to find out at the end of the show. And it's done in a lot of different ways. But it truthfully, rarely happens on stage because that's what a director's for. I mean, if they don't squash that in rehearsal, then that's a bad director. But that's the truth. But in real life, it's a bit more complicated and a bit more involved. My dad would say it like this. Does it really benefit you to feel something about something or make a decision about something that you haven't even experienced yet? Do you think that's all that wise? Don't you think you're cheating yourself out of what could be a fantastic and wonderful moment? And of course, when I was young, it didn't even dawn on me that that could be the case. But I get it. I actually get it now. He'd say, not only are you cheating yourself out of what could be in that moment, but you're cheating yourself out of the very moment you're in, because you're putting all your energy into your future prediction that you're so clinging to, you know? And he said, you know, you can't really decide the outcome. He found it somewhere between foolish and arrogant to behave that way. So in the last 10 months, I'd say the last year of my life, my life has shown me that he was absolutely right. And this past February, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. And at every turn, I'd see a doctor and they would give me a little bit more bad news, which would keep escalating my diagnosis. And it was maxing out my sense of urgency, causing my brain to unravel. I mean, there were so many unknowns, and the things we did know were just terrifying. So it felt impossible not to imagine the worst. But I'm the kind of person that was determined not to live a life that's motivated by fear. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. All I knew that I wasn't in pain, and I didn't feel sick, and it had to count for something. My sister, who is my younger sister, who has really been a rock, and my caretaker, I could tell you how many times we would leave the doctor's office, and we would just get a piece of news, and we'd try to process it and fit it into the bigger picture. And she'd just look over at me and say, hey, play the ending. We don't know. And it was a real comfort. And now I practically say to myself every day, you know, I wake up every day and I remind myself, because I made that commitment, I'm not going to play the ending. And so in not playing the ending, actually, what I found is what was happening was I was filling myself up by playing the ending. I was filling myself up on anxiety and anger and stress. And I thought, you know, what I'd much rather do is fill up on gratitude and hope and love. I was like, those are things that sound a hell of a lot better than the other. And doing that, I made up my mind, I'm not going to play the ending. I can still be prepared. I can still anticipate different outcomes. I'll do that. I'll always do that. But I've slowed down, and honoring this particular tenet has allowed me to be in the moment, and more importantly, the moment I'm in, share it with the people I'm in it with. And that's new. That's real new, because I was a real multitasker and thought I had to wring out as much as I could in a half an hour, you know. And so now that half an hour is what it is, but it's more important that I'm actually in it, not thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow's half an hour, you know. And I've always heard of cancer patients that claim having cancer was the best thing that ever happened to them. And, you know, I could never wrap my brain around it. But I will say I get it. I finally get it. Because I'm not going to say it's the best thing, and I'm certainly not going to say it's better than anything, but I do get what they mean. The diagnosis and this experience has taught me who I am, and it's given me the strength to be vulnerable, and it's also shown me that if we're here for one thing, we really are here to love and to listen. Thank you.